Welcome to IMCC. I'm Teresa Miller and I'll be leading tonight. Tonight's talk is called, actually I had a couple of different titles for it. One is Minding the Gap at Crossroads. Minding the Gap at Crossroads. The other one was Being at Crossroads. Minding the Gap and Being at Crossroads. So basically, I was looking to sort of tie together three reflections on this topic. So as you listen to these, just notice what comes up for you, what's rising. Maybe an expectation or a feeling state or a sensation in the body somewhere, curiosity. So the first idea, that of a crossroads, being at the crossroads. Being at a global crossroads. Global crossroads in this case means climate change, means an intensifying power and resource inequity, species loss, racism, injustice. And the question with that global crossroads is, what is ours to do now in this life, in this world? So if you felt the body or the heart contract a little bit with that enormity of all of that, to just notice that as well. Maybe allow yourself to take a deep breath right now. And the second idea, having to do with minding the gap, is really about noticing, waking up and noticing the gaps, which are a rather precious space. And the question with this reflection is, can we be curious? Can we mind the gap to cultivate a heart-mind that is receptive, that responds internally and externally? And the third idea, which I won't spend as much time with tonight, I hope to devote another talk or maybe even a day long to this one, is about finding refuge. And the question with this one is, we find refuge both or in multiple arenas? One would be in the Dharma guideposts, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, in the compassion of Kuan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion, in Buddha nature, in saints and ancestors, wise ones, and in community, in Sangha. So just starting here with one note, and this has to do with the global crossroads. The 2018 State of the World's Birds, which was released in April of 2018, a year and a half ago, finds that nearly 40% of bird species throughout the world are in decline. Mostly due to loss of habitat through urban and agricultural development, logging. Why does this matter? Well, when we recall what we know about the web of life, the balance between plant and animal life, including insects, pollination, food chains, all of it interwoven, interbeing. So a personal reflection. What's the meaning of bird watching? A rare swallowtail kite near ivy? A single ruddy turnstone, it's a water bird, on the banks near Nag's Head. And 3 adolescent bluebirds playing in a backyard bird bath in late summer. Interspecies connection. Why does that matter? What does it signify? So one of our practices is to keep noticing what's going on to keep waking up, to use the mind to know the mind. Because ordinarily we often just see the projections of our mind, inwardly about ourselves, outwardly about the world. For example, you might notice that you are invested in certain stories that begin with, I'm like this, you're like that. Our tendency, which is somewhat biologically based, is to separate ourselves from each other, from the plant and the animal kingdoms, and from those who don't look or act or speak or think like us. And this can happen especially when we are stressed or a little bit anxious. And that happens when basic needs aren't being met. The basic needs for safety, for satisfaction, for connection. So these projections get solidified, they get frozen a little bit. They get trapped in time. And somehow they congeal into sort of a wedge that has no spaces. So even in simpler experiences, gaps can feel uncomfortable. You might think of a difficult relationship. Anybody got one of those? Or even just temporarily a difficult relationship. Maybe it's somebody you're going to be seeing over the holidays. If there are snags in relationship history, places where you get hooked, it's hard to see or to allow any space, to notice any gaps. And emptiness, that empty space, sometimes feels a bit ungrounding. For example, in a conversation, if there's a silent space, sometimes we feel a need to fill it up. We're not comfortable with it. And we do that with our life. So life, which we fill up with stuff, with whatever's in our life, with possessions, with activity, with stuff, we fill the space. And we keep filling it. And what's the result? Does this feel familiar? Filling space, yeah. So what is heard? What's received when there's stuff? What happens if we make room, release even the cute stuff, the small stuff, the big stuff? What happens when we empty and make space? What's heard? What's available to us now? If we just pause and make a little bit of space, a little gap, we can notice what's available, what's arising. Little gap between our thoughts. Maybe you noticed that during the meditation practice earlier tonight. The word gap, of course, means an opening, a breach, a chasm, an empty space, an unfilled interval. It's related to the word gape, to have an open mouth, wide, to stare, to be wide open. In the Appalachian mountain chain, there are deep breaks, sometimes where the water flows through. And they're called gaps. And in Virginia's mountains alone, including the Blue Ridge, over 75 gaps are named. The two most familiar being the close ones, Rockfish Gap and Jarman's Gap. The gap is a place of change. And seen in the mind, it's a place of potential creativity, innovation, seeing something new. Because the gap creates a break in our rigid routines, our congealed stories. And in that momentary space, there's a possibility of a fresh perception, something new arising. So gaps are places of curiosity, really. And it's also a place of calm abiding, of non-judging awareness. The London subway sign says, "Mind the gap," which of course means the gap between the platform, the subway car. In meditation practice, when we sit in stillness and slow down, we allow space for a little gap to arise between thoughts, between sensations. And when we mind the gap in practice, in meditation, what we're noticing is a simple, non-conceptual awareness between thoughts. And then we get curious about this space, this non-conceptual awareness, the ground out of which a thought arises. So we begin to listen and we think, well, what happens prior to a thought? Can we savor the pause, mind the gap, and see what wants to arise? Here's where we can use the mind to know the mind. So if the mind has seized up on conditions, identifying this one is me, this is me, we are seeing one bubble as the entire ocean. So again, here's where we use some skill. We bring a little kindness to our practice. And we keep investigating this I, this bubble. We perhaps begin to see the view that we're holding on to, or the anger or the resentment. And we can ask the question, who's struggling? Who does this belong to? In a way, what we start to do in that moment is to deconstruct the house of self. And we do it with compassion. Perhaps you've heard these wise words before. Wisdom says, I am nothing, or not a thing. Wisdom says, I am nothing. Compassion says, I am everything. Between these two flows the life of an awakened being. The heart wisdom that we share doesn't have isms or names or countries. We all have a deep root in the kind heart. Although we know with thinking, in one moment there can be a thought that is full of confidence. In the very next moment there's one full of doubt. And it keeps changing, and we wobble. So what to do with the wobble? Mainly we just follow it. Just notice it, listening to that which remains. We can even say to ourselves softly, who's listening? What is this? Who's aware? There's no need to be perfect. Here's a poem from Rilke that speaks to this idea. So if you'd like to just sit back, relax, and close your eyes and listen to these words. Quiet friend who has come so far, feel how your breathing makes more space around you. Let this darkness be a bell tower and you the bell. As you ring, what batters you becomes your strength. Move back and forth into the change. What is it like, such intensity of pain? If the drink is bitter, turn yourself to wine. In this uncontainable night, be the mystery at the crossroads of your senses. The meaning discovered there. And if the world has ceased to hear you, say to the silent earth, I flow. To the rushing water, speak, I am. Little by little, we make space for the unexpected. We abandon being cut off, being contracted. And we inquire, what's wholesome? What's supportive? What's non-harming? What's our practice for ourselves? For each of us individually and as a collective, together on this fragile planet, how do we respond to suffering? To racism, to the gun violence in Oklahoma, to the harm, assault in Hong Kong, to the realities of climate change. Some of us head home, at least temporarily. We want to resign from the arenas of life that have become burdensome or grief-filled. And most of us, when we're honest, at times we'd like to stuff all the bad news into an elevator and push the button that sends it to the deepest basement, at least for a while. And then, of course, here we are in the world. So if you were to evaluate how it is now for yourself, for the planet Earth, what's your intention? And wisdom says, do not discount your being. Do not discount your efforts to do no harm. Every action matters. Every action matters. The world is changing. There's no more business as usual. Global challenges, a profound planetary crisis. This is a dismembering time as we grapple with racism, classism, refugee crises. At some level, knowing that we are often profoundly disconnected from the web of life. So with all these forms changing, we must discover how to take refuge. How we stay in the face of that which is not steady. So one of the questions might be how we find a pillar of concentration in the middle of the swirling river. The practice of meditation, of emptiness, of minding the gap, it's not a spiritual bypassing or a leave-taking. It can be a grounded, real discernment and response to withstand, to bear the circumstance. Maybe you know the story of the last gardener in Aleppo. Anybody familiar with that one? I see a couple heads nodding. So, in the middle of the city of Aleppo in Syria, in the midst of war, a man has a garden, a small garden, and he continually grows the plants, flowers, trees, fruits, nuts, with his young son, and sells the produce to neighbors. And he was interviewed before a bomb took his life. And he talked about this ongoing belief in beauty, in connecting with the web of life, with his neighbors. In the midst of a bombed out city, continually assaulted. Do not discount your being, your living, your efforts to do no harm. Every action matters. So how we cope in the presence of fear, of anger, practicing gathering the mind, beginning again and again, taking refuge in Buddha nature, in community, in the Sangha that is here. Giving thanks is upon us. One of the questions is, can we give the orphans of consciousness, the things we don't want, the stuff we're not proud of, can we give those a place at the table? Tonight, tomorrow, next week? The Buddha pointed to reality and established a path that allows access for all. It's not a path going anywhere, but it is a deepening. We train the mind toward the wholesome. You know, the leaves that have fallen this past couple of months from the maples, the oaks, the hickories, the crabapples, the dogwoods. Falling, they are individual shapes, colors, sizes. On the ground, they blend, they merge, particularities going to ground. Can we allow breath, sound, to take us to ground, forms coming and going, space holding it all? Every sound could be a taxi to take us back to the listening, to the ground, the knowing, the heart. A mind that's inflamed by anger or resentment, jealousy, it's hard for it to move forward. It's rather stuck, so we surrender, we acknowledge hatred is here, anger is known. The mind that's addicted to thought, inflamed by thought, can't see the end of a thought, the space after a thought. So, can we pause? Can we mind the gap, aware of the space between thoughts? Suffering is not a wasted experience. We must have a conscious relationship to suffering. Bring moments of compassion to it, a willingness to surrender. And become aware too of what is projection doing to ourselves, to the collective? what would collective liberation look like? How do we include Mother Nature? A wise one said, I want you to go out and interview the grass, the trees, and the bees. And Joy Harjo, who's a Native American Creek, writes about this in a poem entitled Remember. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life, her mother's, and hers. Remember your father, he is your life also. Remember the earth, whose skin you are, red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life who have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them, listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind, remember her voice. Remember that you are all people and all people are you. Remember that you are this universe. This universe is you. Awareness guides us as we show up and allow ourselves to be empty, empty from our strategies, our fears, and willing to feel what's present. It will move and guide us in simple small steps or a complete radical reviewing, new seeing. In the Buddha's words, when you know for yourselves that something is unwholesome and harmful, then you should reject it. And when you know for yourselves that something is wholesome and beneficial, you should accept it and put it into practice. So I have an exercise here to do, but I'm not sure there's enough time to do it. So I think what I'll do is just read this aloud and let you reflect upon it for a moment, and then maybe turn to a person next to you and articulate what's significant for you from this. So close your eyes just for a moment and imagine. Recalling a time when you paused for a while to watch a wild being, a bird, a chipmunk, a goldfish, a deer, an otter, an ant, a fox. Was there a sense of interspecies connection? And how is that resonating for you now with this reflection?